All right, everyone, thank you and welcome to the Gnomon live stream today. My name is Adam Hartel, and I'll be your host. Today's event is the Art of Creature Creation with Madeleine Spencer. It's going to be a great event. You guys are in store for some really good stuff today. Yeah, my name's Adam. I'm a recruiter here at Gnomon, and it's my honor to introduce our guest to you today. But before I do that, I just would like to say thank you to Lenovo for sponsoring this event. It's due to Lenovo sponsorship that helps us to continue to provide free resources like this stream to the arts community out there. So, with that said, I'd like to introduce our guest. Madeleine Spencer is a creature and character designer in the film industry, as well as an author and educator. She is currently a senior concept artist at Cinesite in London. Starting her career as a makeup effects artist, Madeleine has been making monsters professionally since 2001. Her clients include DNEG, Weta Digital, Weta Workshop, Pixelogic, Gentle Giant Studios, Activision, Hasbro, and numerous other studios. She has worked in the art department and visual development on a variety of films such as Pacific Rim Uprising, The Hobbit Trilogy, Rise of the Planet of the Apes, Life, Wonder Woman, and The Kid Who Would Be King. And she's taught classes in ZBrush for Gnomon since 2006 and produced the 20-hour video training series Introduction to ZBrush 2020 for the Gnomon Workshop. Madeleine is also the author of the highly regarded books ZBrush Character Creation, Advanced Digital Sculpting, ZBrush Creature Design, and ZBrush Digital Sculpting, Human Anatomy. So fantastic guest with us today. And with that, I'll say welcome to the stream, Madeleine. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Cool. Awesome. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for dropping in. So I'm Madeleine Spencer. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And today we're going to be talking about some ideas around creature creation, creature design, a little bit practical and technical approaches, and a lot of maybe theory and ideas around inspiration and ideation and how to think about monsters and some of my thoughts on them. Things that come up often in my creature design class. I teach a creature design class, pardon me, as well as my ZBrush class at Gnomon, on Gnomon Online. And a lot of these things are things that I will touch on in my classes, and things that I'm obviously using every day at work, or they're somewhere in my head. Just a little bit of I guess not housekeeping, but a little bit of if you want to find me online, you can find me at maddiemonster.com. There you'll find my portfolio, resume, blogs, everything, and links to all of my social media. So you can find me there if you go to maddiemonster.com. And also, if you follow my blog, I think you might find it interesting. I put up links to things like these. I do a lot of online events, and you'll find links to the online events, and I'll reference some of those in this talk, where you can go back and watch some live sculpting and things like that. I also do a feature on Maddie Monster's library, just various art manuals that I find useful. I've been obsessively buying art books since I was a kid, and some of them have been with me for decades because I'm old. And I like to put up blog posts about those and share some books that have been useful for me, and hopefully they will be useful for you as well. And I've put up posts there as well about my experience in Cadaver Lab. I did a Cadaver Lab at University of Utah Medical School almost a decade ago now. And blog posts about things like that. So you might find some of that stuff interesting. So I recommend you just go check it out. Also, as was said, that if you like some of the stuff that we're talking about, you're interested in ZBrush as a tool, I do have the Introduction to ZBrush 2020 at the Gnomon Workshop, which if you get Gnomon Workshop access, you get access to that, as well as a plethora of other amazing artist instructional materials. I love it on there. I'm often on there watching tutorials because I'm kind of addicted to them. I listen to them like other people listen to background music. So, getting started, monsters. I love monsters. The trouble with monsters is that they disturb our moral compass, reminding us that we are animals, and animals are like us. This is the power of the hybrid creature. When we look into its human eyes, we see ourselves looking back from the animal body that we deny we inhabit. It's Professor Barbara Creed. She's a cinema professor in Melbourne University and the author of a book that I'll be talking about later. But I want to think today about what are monsters and what are creatures. And when we're making a creature, it's that's fun to create cool shapes and cool animals and cool fantasy characters, but can we dig into that a little bit deeper? Can we dismantle and unpack what we see as horrific, and why do we see it as horrific? And I would say that having a very clear notion of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and what shapes you're using and why you're using those shapes, and what cultural biases you might be touching on and why you're touching on them, can be very, very, very powerful as a designer. And I think those things are very, very important as much as the fundamentals of design. So a lot of the times when I'm teaching, I will go back to basics, foundations of design and sculpting. These are misleadingly simple notions, but they always have to be revisited. Things like form and value. I was just talking with Adam earlier. We were sharing how we really appreciate this book, How to Draw Portraiture in Charcoal by Nathan Fox. And because you wouldn't think that a book about drawing in charcoal would be useful to a sculptor, but it absolutely is, because he so brilliantly breaks down the idea of value distribution and form. Sculpture is just, effective sculpture, effective form in sculpture is just being aware of your values. It's just, instead of putting down the values on a medium like paper, you are manipulating shapes to manipulate light and shadow to give you the value distribution that you want, as well as physically moving your lights and changing them. So it's all the same. Every medium, for the most part, I think, has the same concerns beyond the purely technical aspects of watercolor versus gouache versus pixels, etc. The main concerns are always the same. I'm going to touch a bit on shape language. Shape language, people have actually been talking more and more about, and sort of like the sort of online tutorial class and sphere. It's something like when I was in school, I had industrial design classes, and it's kind of funny. It didn't really. The penny didn't drop for me, even though I was doing classes in industrial design and graphic design as part of my degree. It didn't The penny didn't drop until many years, maybe 2 years later after school, or a year after school, when I was talking to Jim McPherson, who's an amazing sculptor. He used to work for Rick Baker for years. He's a sculptor at Gentle Giant now. That's where I met him. And he was talking about shapes. We were working on a monster, and he's like, those aren't those aren't scary shapes. I was like, what? He's like, yeah, those aren't scary shapes. Those are friendly shapes. Make scary shapes. It's such an abstract idea, but it's stuck with me. The penny just dropped like a ton of bricks in that moment. I was like, oh my gosh, yes, there is an emotion to the abstraction, and I think a lot about shapes, and I feel shapes when I'm working. If you go back and watch some of my live sculpting streams, sometimes I'll be talking about that as I'm doing it. I was like, this doesn't make me feel anxious. This doesn't make me feel like it's aggressive. This feels aggressive. So you could almost say it's a form of synesthesia. I don't believe I have synesthesia, but synesthesia is this very interesting neuro variation where people will smell color or um, hear color or smell sounds. So it's kind of like I often sort of draw that kind of analogy, where it's like you can have a real connection to shapes and shape language and feel them, and I think that's very, very helpful if you just give yourself over to that. There's gesture, of course. Like, gesture is that overall action line going through a composition or a figure or a sculpture. It's the life of your work. We'll try and talk a bit about curves and angles and tangents. Tangents are a big thing, especially when we're presenting our work, because if you're working in ZBrush and presenting it with a Photoshop painting, you have to pick a view. And when you're choosing that view, it's really important to be aware of tangents and the best possible presentation. And so I'm going to lift the curtain and show you some rejected variations for something that I did just recently, and show you why I rejected them. And then we'll talk about themes and thematic consistency, or thematic harmony. But I was saying, I think thematic consistency makes more sense. So that would be, picking like what it is you're trying to say, like what are you trying to communicate with your design, and then keeping that theme consistent between the shapes that you're picking, the references that you're pulling from, even down to the angle. For example, if you're trying to create something that's very aggressive or upsetting, you might choose to offset your triangles in the composition so it feels unsettling. You might choose lighting in a specific way, like in the COVID demoni image, which I'll show later. I specifically chose lighting that was in yellows and greens because I wanted colors that I associate with infection and sickness. And we'll talk a bit about the, the psychology of color and cultural notions of color, because some of these things are culturally coded, and as that becomes more and more important as the world becomes more global, that something that is frightening or something that is sinister to one culture may not be to another. Example: a friend of mine just purchased this beautiful bit of a katana from Japan, and it has bats on it. And he mentioned when he was sharing images of it, he's like, the bat isn't creepy. In Japanese culture, it represents luck and good fortune. I think there's even that comes from China, because the Chinese character for good luck is the same as bat. I can't remember specifically what he said, but it stuck with me because I was thinking about giving this presentation and mentioning that a lot of times things that we code a certain way, things that are coded as creepy, things that are coded as disturbing, that can be culturally um, specific. So that's something to be aware of as well. Um, I always, in my classes, recommend, like I said, back to the basics. And this is actually a really good book. I spent a long time trying to find a very, very good book to recommend to my students on design. And by design, I mean like graphic design, like very, very abstract things, because it was really important to me to make sure that people in my classes were getting a really good foundation in the basics of design. And I'm talking about things like, this. I've got the book right here. I can't see my own camera right now, but this is Design Basics by David Lauer, and it's very, very important if you go seeking this book out. It's very cheap if you get the 6th edition. The cover you see on your screen right now, the 6th edition is the best one. There's others that are very expensive, but those have a lot of different art in them. And this particular edition focuses a lot on abstract expressionism, as well as Renaissance art, 19th century art, and graphic design to illustrate these concepts such as like unity, balance, repetition, emphasis, and focal point. So if I just open up to sort of like a random page here, let's see. Oh, texture. We won't do that. We'll do line. Here we go, line. So, there's everything from Liechtenstein to, is it Renoir? Who is that? No, it's Botticelli. Botticelli. The book goes into the nuances of line, goes into what line is and what that means as an abstraction, and how it's applied to different media. So it'll be a very abstract book, but I guarantee you it'll be worth the £5 or $7 or whatever that it'll cost to get it. And it's it's invaluable to just always keep your eye on the foundations and always bring yourself back to the foundations. So a little bit of some of my recent work. This was from the Kid Who Would Be King. So at DNAG, I was in the art department on Kid Who Would Be King, doing design work on Morgana, who had 3 different forms. This is her 3rd form here, which is quite cool. We had some initial art that was sent over from the client, and we continued the development process in the art department, working up what her eventual shape would be. So here we have Morgana in her final form. It's a lot of fun. This is a fun movie. It's a retelling of the Arthurian legend through contemporary kids in London, and it's just a great film. It's a lot of fun. This is the 2nd form of Morgana, where she still has legs. So the 3rd form, I unfortunately don't have images for. It was just a makeup design with some digital eye spreading and veining and things for her first sort of uncanny presentation, where she's starting to transform. Uncanniness is something that I'm very, very interested in. I believe that there is like a hierarchy of horror, where you have things like body horror and the grotesque, which is you know very in your face, so to speak. And then you can have things like the uncanny, which is unsettling. Think like David Lynch. Think um, some of the designs in 30 Days of Night, which, if I'm not mistaken, were done by my good friend Gino Acevedo, who also has a Gnomon workshop video that's very, very good to watch if you're interested in painting, and especially painting translucency in skin. Um, but 30 Days of Night, there was some wonderful use of the uncanny there with just a slight digital eye spread on some of the vampires to make them feel wrong, to make it unsettling to look at them. And then you've got the sublime, which I'll talk about a bit more. Sublime is one of those words like awesome, which has lost most of its meaning in the English language. But the sublime is quite a powerful concept. It really was explored in the 18th century. A lot of philosophers started talking about the sublime. The sublime is something that you encounter like in religious art. And it doesn't matter the religion, but the religious art often touches on notions of the sublime. It's the beauty that overwhelms and destroys. So, for example, walking into, or like Caspar David Friedrich, the German romantic painter, would paint these vast landscapes with this tiny little person in them. That would be the sublime. Or Edgar Allan Poe, author in the 18th century, early 19th, 18th, late 18th, early 19th. Anyway, so Edgar Allan Poe has a story which is sort of like, the seminal text about the sublime horror, which is called Descent into the Maelstrom, which is about a sailor who's trapped in a massive storm at sea on the edge of a whirlpool, and he clings to a piece of wood, and it's like against nature. So that sublime is something that I find quite inspiring, and something I'll touch on a little bit more later. But there's different types of horror, different types of um, aesthetic sort of ways to be unsettling aesthetically. This is just a personal piece. This one's called Levana of the Black Nativity. I did this as the cover image for the ZBrush 2020 Gnomon workshop bit. Inspiration for this was actually one of my favorite authors. I get a lot of inspiration from literature, and we'll talk about that as well. This was inspired by Thomas de Quincey, who I think is the greatest single author of the English language ever. Sorry, Shakespeare. Thomas de Quincey. If you're interested, he has a book called Confessions of an English Opium Eater, and I believe he was 17th century or early 18th century, and actually absolutely amazing, incredibly ahead of its time. It reads like surrealism, but it's quite disturbing and beautiful, and that's something that interests me a lot. The contradistinction between the disturbing and the beautiful. And like I said, also, I find myself very influenced by religious iconographies, like, and especially from the Western canon, like Roman Catholicism and Greek Orthodox, Byzantine icons, things like that. And the reason that I like these things is because there is a there's something regal and imposing and sublime often that comes into that sort of art, and it's just what I grew up around, and I find it very interesting to deliberately sort of utilize it in a different way by taking the visual language of the icon or the saint, and then using it with something horrifying or grotesque. So that's just something that I quite enjoy as well. So this was actually another piece that I did specifically for a Gnomon training series. I think it was the previous one that I did. But we'll talk about this guy in a little bit. This is from Pacific Rim, so this is some film work. This is the Breach Kaiju, and I'll talk about the process with the Breach Kaiju, because oftentimes you'll start with something and it'll be, yeah, we love it, but then it changes massively before the end. So we'll talk a bit about where I went with this and how we ended up getting to where we ended up with on screen. I don't know if you've seen Pacific Rim Uprising. I ended up seeing on a plane. I find that I've seen a lot of the movies that I work on in like bits and pieces throughout the process of them being made, and so I often have a funny notion of what the movie's actually about. And then when I finally see it, I was like, oh, that's what that scene was all about. So I've read the script, but it's like it's just kind of funny. I'm very, very busy, so oftentimes I don't get to see the things that I work on until much, much later. For Pacific Rim Uprising, I had a great opportunity to go and design the skin on the kaiju. So I basically did a whole bunch of different paintings of kaiju skin, what their colorations would look like. So I did not do these designs. These were the core kaiju that were actually more or less established. but the skin was not. So I did a whole bunch of variations of skin texture for them, which was fun trying to pick out what they would look like because the director was very specific that this film would be very brightly lit and he wanted bright colors. So it was a lot of fun to work with that. Um, this is one of a couple of pieces we'll be talking about today. This one's COVID Demoni 19, which is just a personification of coronavirus or COVID-19. Again, pulling from some different elements that we'll talk about that was very specifically chosen and specifically arranged to play on, certain tropes and certain ideas. Um, of course, there's the actual virus itself in there. There's the 19 Roman numeral because Roman numerals look badass, don't they? I mean, seriously, you put Roman numerals on anything and it's just cool. um, and ideas around like respiration and suffocation and infection and these very jagged kicks and the curves because I like things that have sort of a reverse curve. That's another thing too. Like you might not think this, but if you're doing creature design, and it's something you want to do, I would highly recommend getting books on 2D animation, like the Animator's Workbook, Animator's Toolkit. Um, Look at books about drawing for animation because it's absolutely and what makes sort of animation style, toon style so very challenging is that it's stripped down to just the most economy of line and the most basic shapes to communicate very, very clear ideas. And so you'll learn about things like reverse curves. You'll learn about contrasting a curve against a straight line. Um, and those things you can carry forward into more complex designs. And I put that in quotes because, like I often will say, like some of the most difficult things to do are things like feature animation style characters because those, again, you have a very you're working with an economy of shape, which you're not typically working in necessarily in other forms, but being sensitive to those ideas still is very, very important. I hope that makes sense. If not, you can ask the questions and then they can chime in with the questions as I'm going. And then the Bogey Lady, which we'll talk about as well. Another piece that we'll go into, just talk about the way this was put together. And by the way, both these pieces, these last two, you can see these designed and sculpted online. I did COVID Demoni over 3 ZBrush Live sessions. If you go to the ZBrush Live YouTube page, you can actually watch this. I had the general idea and then worked it up live on camera for the most part. And then Bogey Lady, she was sculpted live on camera for the most part for Cave Academy, which you can also find that linked on my blog if you go to my blog at maddiemonster.com. So inspiration, like who inspires you, where to look for inspiration. And it doesn't always have to be other creature artists. Even that's a wonderful place to look. Be on ArtStation, see what other people are doing. Look at the people whose work you look up to. Look at people like, like Rob Bottin, Rick Baker, like people from the 80s and the 90s that were doing this amazing work and see the types of shapes that were trending then. That's another thing too, just like there's fashion forecasting, there's fashion trending. I notice that there's shapes and color palettes that trend, and I don't say that in a disparaging manner. It's just things enter into the zeitgeist, and people respond to them. And it could be something as explicit as, you know, when the movie 300 came out. I was working on a movie, and and we all said that Friday, I bet you anything on Monday they're going to come in and say, "Can we make this look like make these guys look like Spartans?" And that did come up. So it could be as explicit as that, or it could just be something that's just sort of just under the surface. The zeitgeist has just picked up on this one particular color palette that you just see popping up over and over again. So it can create a bit of an echo chamber. So I do like to look in unusual places for inspiration. Also, I'm attracted to unusual things. So I'm going to be there in those unusual spaces anyway. So I might as well try and get inspired by them. I'm going to show you some people that inspire me. This is one of my favorite artists. This is Odilon Redon. He's a 19th century symbolist painter. And his use of color, I think, is terrifying. I think it's absolutely beautiful and harrowing. It's the first painter that I ever saw that, I I had a fine arts degree, and I did a lot of painting, but he was the first painter that I looked at and went, "Oh my gosh, that's his use of color is terrifying." And he's always be painting these very creepy, sort of dreamlike mythological scenes. Also, Jean Delville, 19th century symbolist painter, France, and I think it's quite apparent, like the image on the right, how that you could probably see some of that in some of the work that I've already shown. Um, there's this, bilateral symmetry, and this really, or there's a bit of bilateral symmetry. He's breaking the symmetry, of course, as you should. Um, and playing around with the notions of like the femme fatale and the religious iconography and this fantasy elements. It's quite beautiful. I love his work. This is another of his pieces here. It's a Medusa. Um, and there's all sorts of signifiers in here that are specific to the 19th century. And I really like that. I like putting things into pieces or being aware of things in pieces I see that um, have connotations specific to their time or the meaning. The poppies, of course, were for laudanum, which was very, very popular in the 19th century. And of course, there's the whole discourse around the femme fatale. This is like an archetypal femme fatale image. And there's a plethora of really amazing writing about the femme fatale and what that means and what that says culturally about women's roles in society and the way women are perceived in society when they are cast as villains. So that's something we'll talk about a little bit later as well. um, Very inspired by Clive Barker as a painter as well. These are very, very graphic shapes, but they're very, very strong. And I love the strong lines and curves that he uses and the way that he is able to be playful, but still create these sort of very sort of disturbing creatures and characters in these very, very broad lines. I think they're really lovely. Like there's almost a William Blake quality. There's, like, something about his work that just reminds me of, like, William Blake's exuberance for color and line. And then, Yashiro Nirasawa, who's, unfortunately passed away a little bit ago, but he was an incredible, creature designer from Japan, and his work is very, very influential for me, as well as some other, Japanese artists, that have that similar kind of, uh demonic surrealist sort of style going on. Um, so monsters. So monsters. I've never been afraid of monsters. I grew up obsessed with them. There's never been a moment that I was not obsessed with monsters. I remember one of the happiest memories of my childhood is when I asked my mother if I could keep the Halloween decorations up in my room year round, thinking that that was a massive ask. And she's like, "No, that's fine." And so I was like, "Yes, I get the skeletons in my room all year round." Um, Monsters, they're beautiful outsiders, and to me, they inspire awe and fascination and not revulsion, and I think that's actually quite common amongst a lot of people that tend towards making monsters, that we are as we're designing something, we're seeking that sense of awe, that sense of wonder, um, even if it's looked at by someone else and they go, "Ooh, that's creepy," or "That's disgusting." I've never had that reaction to them, um, but I'm aware that some things that I do would inspire that in other people. Um, there's a really good book called The Powers of Horror by Julia Kristeva. Now, you might not think to look in some place like this for inspiration, but Kristeva is a postmodern philosopher. She wrote about something called abjection, and abjection is just it's a framework. It's a philosophical framework by which we talk about the things that, as a society, we reject and consider monstrous. And she really gets down into the minutia of what it means to be horrified by something. And she says that, like in that first quote by Barbara Creed at the beginning, that monsters, that horror basically makes us question borders, makes us question the difference between ourself and something else. Um, she talks about, the ultimate symbol of abjection is like a corpse, because that calls into question the border between being alive and being dead. And so basically, societies or cultures will tend to abject those things which make them question borders, and hybrid creatures and monsters, or chimera as the ancient Greeks would call them. Those are abjected because they force you to question borders and question your own place in the world. Um, we already mentioned the sublime, the grotesque, and the uncanny. The book is here. It's the powers of horror. Um, it's a bit academic. The language can be a bit of a slog to get through, but it's worth reading. I think it's quite good. Um, Another book that is really, really interesting, because, like I was saying before, that if you explore kind of cultural notions around cultural and philosophical notions around monsters, around horror, you can become aware of these biases and then deliberately poke them or play with them or be aware of them. And it's always better to be aware of these things rather than just be driven by them or carried along by them. So, this is a book called The Monstrous Feminine, Film, Feminism, and Psychoanalysis by Barbara Creed. And this book is from the 1990s. She's a cinema professor in Melbourne. And this book is fascinating. Her reading, and when I say reading, it's like it's an interpretation. I'm not saying that when you get a book like this, it's not saying this is the way everything truly is. It's a reading. It's an interpretation of horror. So her interpretation of horror was quite unusual for the 1990s. So in a genre where women were usually sort of framed as victims, she wrote about horror and monsters as being like a patriarchal reaction to a fear of women's bodies and women's autonomy. And she frames it through the idea of like Alien being body autonomy and pregnancy, and being a terror of not being able to control pregnancy or forced pregnancy. She talks about Reagan in The Exorcist, the ultimate symbol of innocence and purity, spouting obscenity and terror. Um, there's also, going all the way back to the witch. The idea of the witch being, you see these medieval woodcuts of these creepy old women, and the witch trials. Well, why are these witches scary? What is it about witches that were scary? Well, why were they always portrayed as old women? Barbara Creed would say that our culture has a fear of the elderly, and elderly women no longer exist in a sphere that can be controlled in terms of you are to be married, or you are to be beautiful, or you're to be this, or you be that. They've exited out of that sphere, and they can't be controlled, and so they become upsetting, and you can't pin that down. They become liminal, and so that's where she would argue the idea of the witch comes from, and the fear around the witch. So those sort of things are interesting, and it might not be something that you stumble across in the usual day-to-day thinking about monsters, but I think it's very, very applicable. And like I said, it's always nice to sort of dissect, so to speak, and really figure out specifically what it is you're saying or reacting to. Great book. It's on Amazon. It's not very expensive. So let's talk about some monster stuff. So Breach Kaiju. So this was from Pacific Rim Uprising, and I'll just talk a bit about the process of this. This is the original design that I had for the Breach Kaiju, which I really liked. But we didn't end up with this in the end. It was approved, but just because something's approved doesn't mean it's approved. It can change at any moment, and often does, and it can change up to the last minute. So the Breach Kaiju, the brief was Mantis. I think that's all that I got was praying mantis. He's only on screen briefly because he comes up out of the water and then he's cut apart by some laser beams. And I thought it would be a great chance to riff on Cthulhu, because I mean everybody wants to see Cthulhu on screen. It's just, I mean, everybody's just been waiting to see Cthulhu in a kaiju movie. I mean, because they're all really coming from the same place, which is the sublime, by the way. Like Cthulhu is Lovecraftian horror would be classified under that sublime horror I was talking about. It's existential and cosmic in scale. So you could have this. I was thinking you could have like a tentacle reveal coming up out of the water, and it would be very, very Cthulhu-esque, very Lovecraftian. Um, So this is what we ended up with on screen. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. It's cool. I like the head design. My friend did the head design. I thought it was really good. But so what do you do when you've got to design a bunch of like crustacean slash cephalopod slash primate monsters? Well, we got up at 4 a.m. and went to the Billingsgate Fish Market here in London, where you have to get up at 4 a.m. to actually get anything. And these are some photos that I took when I was there. This guy here is very, very friendly. He was holding up all the stuff so I could photograph it. The place smelled terrible. I still haven't eaten seafood since this was years ago. I still haven't eaten seafood since then. But it was fantastic reference, and fantastic ideas to come out of this. And actually, this image we used a whole bunch on the left, as well as a river lobster, a river. crawdad or something. It was a river, not a river lobster. No, I guess it was a river lobster, but we used that a lot for reference. So, we would reference nature to achieve like a level of interest and veracity in the design, which would otherwise, potentially be unattainable. We wanted to draw heavily on crustaceans and cephalopods, so you can't beat going to reference, going to the source. And I think two things about reference: nobody uses reference as much as they should, and a lot of times we're not using it as much as we like to tell ourselves we are. But it's anytime you go back to reference, it's going to help. I started out just by doing a whole bunch of like really quick little sketchy things in ZBrush and Photoshop. This was just, it wasn't quite kaiju, but it was working out the bugs, working out the other shapes. I do a lot of ideation on Post-it notes. I always have Post-it notes on my desk. This is where I like to thumbnail because they're disposable. They're only so big, and you can peel them off and stick them up on a wall and see them together and rearrange them. Eventually, I worked out these ideas here. Now, these are just very, very fast little things that are put together in ZBrush. Sometimes the parts aren't even, I think we had Dynamesh at this point. I'm trying to remember if we had Dynamesh yet. We may not have, but sometimes these things are Frankenstein together to get an idea across. And here, just Frankensteining different pieces together to show what the creature could look like, how the mouth might function. So. And what the abdominal teeth would be like. So my idea with this was that the kaiju are designed by an alien race to destroy human cities and destroy Jaegers. So this one didn't have to be seen from the waist down. So there's no telling what's down beneath what you see. He didn't have to be running around a city, so we could communicate a lot with the top. And I thought, well, it'd be neat if the limbs were, functional only as weapons. Like there's no way this thing can feed itself. There's no way it can live in any way, shape, or form. It just exists to come to Earth and slice down buildings and Jaegers. And then there's the little pincers at the chest where it could, if it could hook those scythe arms around something, those mantis arms around a Jaeger and pull it close, it could, those could be ripping at bits and be quite destructive. And I also liked the idea of just the rhythm of the shapes repeating, going down the length of the body, and the tentacles for Cthulhu. Definitely Cthulhu was in my head at the time. Um, so it was approved, and it was like they loved it, and it was going forward. But then, as happens, and this is just the nature of the beast. This always happens. Somebody gets another idea. They're like, "Oh, let's change this. Let's do this or that." And so the idea was put forward. Well, can we put a rhino kind of head on there? So I did up a version with a rhinoceros head, and just quickly dropped it into the same scene to give an idea of what that might look like. Um, and then Jonathan Opfagen, the art director, who is a friend and amazingly talented artist, did a drawing on the tube on his way into work, and director liked it, so that was this head. So I sculpted this head based on his drawing, and then pasted that onto the existing body, which had changed also. It became bipedal instead of that sort of long serpentine, scythe kind of thing. And then there we see it in the film. Adam, can you still see my stuff? I just realized I haven't heard anything, so I just want to make sure that. Okay, okay, cool, cool. All right, cool, thank you. So this is what it ended up look like being in the movie. So it's quite a long and winding path from the first thing that's like, oh, this is great, to the last thing that's, oh, this is great. But that's another thing too. Then something I had to learn, kind of a trial by fire, because when I first got started working in art departments, was you can't really be married to an idea, because it's going to change sometimes, just because it's going to change. So just because something is like, yeah, we're going with this, don't become so invested in it personally that it like breaks your heart if it changes. I had a dwarf design that literally changed the day before shooting started on Hobbit, but that's fine. I was used to it by then, because it's just like, there's all sorts of different moving parts, and something that's you know working one day isn't the next, so that's fine. Um, so Yeah, Levana, the Black Nativity. So I mentioned this image before, where it was just sort of pulling from uh, religious iconography and the I want to say the Pieta, but the Pieta is the deposition. It's the Pieta is Mary at after the crucifixion. I'm trying to remember. Oh, this is the nativity. Jesus, it's so just sort of using that sort of iconography and but bringing in obviously sort of almost Constantine-esque or demonic elements into it because that's just fun. And again, like I said, this is just a personal piece that was done for the introduction to ZBrush 2020 um, training series. Uh, and some considerations in this that were really important. It needed to be this aspect ratio. So I knew that I was working at this aspect ratio. The I specifically chose to use this sort of equilateral triangle in the composition where you've got leading lines. So I'm often thinking about leading lines. Leading lines are lines that don't necessarily exist in the image. They are implied. So you can have this leading line here. This is a line going up to this guy's line of sight. Then there's no line there, but it's guiding you up to her. And then there's this leading line here going up to here. So all roads lead to Rome, being the creepy demon skull woman in the center and her very, very happy baby. I I think when I was putting this together that I was thinking how I was going to do the composition because I'll think about that early on because a lot of times you're doing something that's for a specific view that you want to pick the best possible presentation of that view, and then make sure that if it's approved, then you can go back and finish the rest of the sculpture if need be. Now, I never recommend people that are just learning ZBrush to just sculpt part of something. I feel quite confident doing it because I've been sculpting in some capacity, since I was little, really. Uh, Professionally, I was a professional sculptor in clay for years before I even knew there was a ZBrush. So I feel quite confident sculpting something from the angle that I know it's going to be presented for the most part, and then going back and working the rest of it. Um, so a lot of stuff like this is going to be a presentation image. So I'm thinking early on, how am I going to actually compose this? How I'm going to frame this? And we'll talk about that in COVID Demoni in a minute. Um, yeah, so COVID Demoni 19. Personifying contagion as a malicious entity to while away the pleasant summer hours. As you do. So again, this was something that was actually sculpted live online over 3 ZBrush live sessions that you can go see if you want to see it coming together. And a lot of the ideas I was coming together, I was working out on the fly, sort of like so people could sort of see how I think about things. It was actually much more challenging than I thought it would be because I mean I can sculpt something live. I do it a lot because I teach every week. But thinking around an idea and like vocalizing what I was thinking and why I was thinking it as I'm thinking it, that was actually quite challenging. Um, so in this, I was pulling from a variety of different themes, and like I was saying, thematic consistency. So I wanted, I was thinking about respiration, suffocation, infection, um, curves and angles. Like I really like those reverse curves, like I was saying, but with a kick in them, so they could be a little aggressive, like this sweet curve here, kick, kick. Those things can just make something feel like it has malicious intent. A shape can have malicious intent. Um, the exposed lungs, of course, that's self-evident, and the shape of the head itself is based on the COVID-19 virus. There's the little spikes coming out, or the protein stalks that it uses to actually inject its DNA into other cells, and the halo is made of ribs, which respiration and chests, and the nasal passages are covered up. The eyes are covered because I just sort of like that sort of look. I like denying the opportunity to connect something's humanity through its eyes, but still it's humanoid. I find that pretty creepy. And I realized the other day where that comes from. because these things you can always like look back and think, where did I first see that? And I finally remembered what it was that planted that image in my head, and you're gonna laugh. It was the movie The Goonies. The movie The Goonies. I remember when Mikey lifted up the eye patch on One-Eyed Willie, and there was just skull there. That freaked me out when I was little, and I think that's how that first got found its way into my head. Wasn't it? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. Yes. The you see everyone's wearing masks everywhere now, and it is, unusual now to see someone without a mask, without an uncovered mouth. That's such a good point. I hadn't, even thought of that, but it was definitely, there in the subconscious because I've been out and about like everybody else. Um, and, excuse me. I, I opened the chest cavity for that sort of infectious kind of quality, covered the nasal passages, so suffocation, and the open mouth for and the reaching out. We'll be able to talk more about the pose in a moment when we can see the full character. So I was when I was first approaching this, the things that I was thinking about were this images painted during plagues or about plagues. This is Salvatore Rosa, Humana Fragitalis. So it's 1657, and people didn't live as long as we live now. And there was a lot of painting around memento mori, like paintings around death and notions of death and acceptance of death. Um, and those I think are really really interesting, especially those that are created during plague times. One of my favorite illustrators is Harry Clark, and I think you could probably look at this and see some of the Harry Clark that's in Covid Demoni in terms of that long, lanky proportion. This is an illustration from Mask of the Red Death, the Edgar Allan Poe story about a plague. Personified that invades a space that is supposed to be safe, where people have these very very wealthy people have hidden themselves away from the contagion outside, but it still finds its way in. um, Beautiful story. Like you can't go wrong revisiting Edgar Allan Poe once every year. And Harry Clark as well, beautiful, but a huge inspiration. Sorry for the siren that's going by outside. Were the plague waxes. So I spent some time in Florence, and I think almost every other week I would go to La Specula, where these are. La Specula is an amazing museum across the Arno from the sort of city center, the tourist center of Florence. It's a natural history museum. But this is a wax sculpture by Zumbo. He was a master figure sculptor and kind of obsessed with disease and corruption. So he's best known for his anatomical models that are at La Specula and the Museum of Natural History in Firenze. But he also created a series of memento mori like these for his patron, the Duke of Tuscany, based on the decomposition of the human body. This is one of the waxes at Specula, and I think they're beautiful. I mean, like I said, I've done Cadaver Lab, and again, to me, it wasn't grotesque or scary. It was beautiful and it was sublime. It was like I often say, like going into the Cadaver Lab felt like going into a cathedral. It was incredible and it was profound. And I love the fact that these Renaissance waxes are not just a body laid out, like these are this you this person is in a posture and they almost look like they're in pain and without their skin. These actually inspired Clive Barker for the film Hellraiser. Hellraiser features a character without skin, and that was inspired by Albrecht Dürer and these plague waxes or these anatomical waxes. Um, a woman I know, Joanna Epstein, wrote an amazing book about the genre of wax anatomical figures. Predominantly, they were female. There's a lot of them, and they called them anatomical Venuses. And her book is called The Anatomical Venus, and it's quite a good book. She's an amazing scholar and writer. You should definitely check that book out. I have to drink some iced coffee. One moment, please. So these are the little dioramas, and this is about the size of a shoebox. They're hidden in a little corner in La Specula, and you could miss it easily. You could easily miss these, and I would just keep going back to them. I became just so enamored with them because they're so translucent. This photograph doesn't do them justice. They look like skin because they're made of wax, and they have such pathos, and there's such sadness and terror and beauty in them, and the little painted backdrops are amazing. And if you know, there was uh, the Renaissance was quite a violent time, and you know, there's war and plague, and you know, all sorts of terrible things going on. I guess just like today, but that sort of tone is present throughout the piece. And this is another view of it here, where you can kind of get a sense of the scale. And so I love the fact that it, you know, used these greens for the decomposing bodies, and then you know, contrasted it with this very fleshy, very living form here for this person who's depositing another body in this pile. So it's quite morbid, I suppose. And I only say that because you know, to me it's not. I mean, you often have to throw caveats like that in, but you know, we're amongst friends. This stuff is beautiful, and this stuff is inspiring and amazing, um, and it's powerful because it's an intense and powerful subject matter, and it's treated so explicitly. Um, Here's some other close-ups. And I really love this one on the right because the way he treats the decomposition and the putrefaction is amazing, with the cheeks being eaten away. There's something you know, quite visceral and real about it. So I pulled together all this sort of stuff and was thinking around these things when I was trying to come up with this idea, and doodling around in my sketchbook, which brings me to like sketchbooks. We'll talk about sketchbooks. So everybody always says, you know, you should keep a sketchbook, and people often try and keep a sketchbook, but they end up with like a whole bunch of sketch. How many of you have a sketchbook that has like 10 pages of stuff in it and the rest of it's empty? And then you're like, okay, I'll buy a new sketchbook and start a new one, and you don't get through it. So it occurred to me that when I was in school, we had to keep a sketchbook. I mean, I keep a sketchbook anyway because I enjoy keeping in a sketchbook, but a lot of times it can become a chore, I think, because of the way people approach it. And when I was in school, we had to keep a sketchbook, and we had to turn that sketchbook into our instructor each term to be graded to make sure that we had done it. They didn't grade the quality of it; they just graded that you were living in it. And you know, you're an artist, and you carry this book around all the time. It becomes your diary essentially. It was actually really funny, having to turn it in. But what happened was there was a culture. This is at the school that I went to, at Savannah College of Art and Design. There was a culture around the sketchbook where you would not pick up someone else's sketchbook. You would not. Absolutely not. You would not open someone else's sketchbook. You wouldn't go through it. You might decide to show your sketchbook to somebody else, and that could be quite intimate, like, hey, you want to see my, check this out. And we'd always joke that we had like the I can draw drawing in the sketchbook, because there'd be the drawing, you know, there'd be a good drawing in there that you would like show people, because sketchbooks are going to have a lot of crap in them. And I think, and I was talking to a friend of mine recently, a very, very well-known designer in the film industry, and I was talking to him about this, that people need to feel empowered to know that you can do little crappy doodles. Not everything in it has to be perfect. And the best thing to do is never treat your sketchbook like, I'm showing my sketchbook because I'm trying to get the point across. Otherwise, I wouldn't. Like, I would show drawings that I thought, you know, were good or okay, but I want it to be clear that your sketchbook can be like full of things that are half finished or just thoughts or abstractions. And if you treat it as something that you never have to show anyone else, I think it's very empowering to continue living in it and working in it and exploring in it, because the more you do inside of it, the better everything else is going to be, and the better your ideas will be thought out. And I think it's easier to do that if you're not, you know, make it the one thing that you're not thinking about, like, you have to impress somebody with. It's just there for you. Like, don't do it thinking, "Oh, I'm gonna post this drawing up on Facebook, or I'm gonna post this up on LinkedIn," or just let it be the place where you just go get ideas and nobody ever has to see it. And, I think that, having that first experience for us when we were in school was really, really helpful because nobody ever had to see the sketchbook, but the professor who would page through it just to make sure that you had filled it. That was it. And they can become quite something when you treat them that way. So ideas. So like I said, the COVID virus itself, respiration, infection, suffocation, dangerous lines, lungs and thoracic, uh, the thoracic arch. So there's the coronavirus itself, the little protein stalks. I knew that I wanted that to be like a crown. Um, the halo came later. Usually I doodle in bed, either in Procreate or in my sketchbook, and I'll like kind of like just doodle ideas as I'm falling asleep. And then I'll wake up with like a Prismacolor marker that's like all over me. but but like I said, just play these things. They don't have to be there to impress anybody. They just have to be ideas. You're just thinking, and the halo came about. The rib halo came about one night before I was falling asleep. I was like, oh, that would be really cool. And that found its way into one of the pages, and then I went on to the next page, and then the next day I was going back through the stuff, and I was like, oh yeah, that would be nice. These are the little yellow post-it notes. Like they can just be little crappy drawings. They don't have to be good. They're just ideas. They're just visual notes to yourself. I think that was for the little hooks and the little sockets inside the lungs. I think that was when I think I made a couple curves and then thought, oh, yeah, I'll make that something. And then I think it ended up becoming a plug for the lungs. I don't think I was actually setting out to make that anything at first. Um, so yeah, basically I just sort of immersed myself in sort of the iconography and the ideas and the shapes and the things that I wanted to pull from. And and then see what came through. And this is what came through. So this is COVID demoni 19, which I thought it would be interesting to sort of like personify plague as a spirit or demon, because that's not uncommon. I mean, there's in Christian eschatology being the study of the end of the world, or eschatology being the end of the world. So you can have eschatology for different, it's a notion in religious studies. It's not specific to any specific religion. Any religion that has a notion of Ragnarok is eschatological. So like the horsemen of the apocalypse, they were pestilent angels, and I thought that was quite interesting. So I was wanted to get something like that across. I'm going to like point out here. I don't know if you can see my pointer. I guess you can see my pointer. So like I was deliberately thinking about the curves and the arcs leading your eye through. I wanted the halo here. The 19 came later. I was like, oh, I just want to put a big bold graphic element up there. So I put the 19 on there like a brand or something, which is disturbing because then you think, there's 18 other demon virus angels that he had to fight to get this title. um, but it's like, yeah. So you've got this circle, this arc here, this arc here. This is an S curve that comes back through here. I'm always thinking about how the curves and the lines flow through the design. These metallic parts coming out of the hips here, which I liked the shape. That's something I tell my students also, by the way. Like if this were in a design room, if this were in an art department like presentation, and somebody said, "What's that do?" I would never say, "I don't know." At least like get good at making up bullshit on the fly. Don't ever say if somebody asks you, "What's that do?" Don't go, "I don't know," because that's the art director or the director or the VFX soup engaging with the design and wanting you to tell the story because we're telling stories with imagery. So that's them going, "Oh, what's that do?" They want to know. They want you to pull them deeper into this fantasy. So don't squander that opportunity. So if somebody said like, "What is that?" I'll be like, "Well, that's these weaponized pieces that are coming off of the hip bones of this particular. If this were like an alien or something, I'd say these are implants where these are the warrior class, and so they've had their hips augmented so they can swing their hips and slash something. I don't know. I'd come up with something. It's a good skill to have though. If somebody like if you're not prepared and somebody says, "What's that do?" to come up with something on the fly, because I do think it's a bad thing to say I don't know in that context. I don't think it's a bad thing to say I don't know in general. I love it when I can say I don't know, like if I have to learn something new. I love that. I love learning some. I love discovering something that I didn't know before. So these little spikes coming off the sides here. These are just sort of like abstract extensions off these ribs, but I deliberately, and if you go watch the video where I'm making these, I deliberately feed these into these same lines of the the thoracic here, the rib cage. They're coming off, and there's a rhythm there. Where there's one, they're getting progressively smaller as they go down, and they're deliberately feeding back up this line. Um, Again, this leading lines. Oops, I've got my touch screen turned on. Let me go back. Oh, wait, no. Show navigator. I'm using a Cintiq, so I gotta turn the touch off. There we go. And the negative spaces we'll talk about in a minute. Let's take this opportunity to go over to Photoshop, and we'll talk about this stuff. So, Photoshop. Photoshop. There we go. So there we are, and here we are. So yeah, that's the original. So let's take away all the color and light. Oh, by the way, I want to mention that too. So like I was saying, like I thematic consistency. So yellows and greens, typically we associate with infection or sickness. Interestingly, like it's very interesting to look at color psychology and look at the way our culture in like the West, if you're well, I mean, if you're in like Europe or North America, like how European culture influenced the readings of certain colors and how that's changed. Like in the 19th century, yellow in France and England was a color that represented decay of society and dissipation. They called the 1890s the yellow 90s. Oscar Wilde was associated with the color yellow because of the Yellow Book, which was a journal that he was published in, which was considered very scandalous. So yellow, who would have thought it? So what else? There's of course there. I'll leave it to you, but you get what I mean. Like you can find all sorts of ideas around color. So I chose the greens and the yellows specifically for pus and sickness and phlegm. If we go over to this, and also like I have a hotkey. Like if you don't have a hotkey yet in Photoshop to do this, what are you even doing? You gotta have a hotkey to do that. Cause like, man, flipping that stuff horizontally just like shows you everything you've done wrong. Also, it was really good because I was working on it like this, and I was like, God, it's not working, it's not working, it's not working. And then when I flipped it like this, it flowed a lot better for me because what was happening was because we read left to right, if English is our first language, um, you're hitting that. Let me flip it again. Sorry for the siren going by. They're looking for me, but they're not going to find me. So here we go. We read left to right, so we hit that first, and then it was just leading me down here. It's like, that just wasn't working. And then when I finally got around to flipping it, since we scan an image left to right, if I get here, so I get where I want to get. Hit that. That keeps me from going off the picture plane. And then I come down here, it leads me down to the hand, which is my little Bernie Reichsten hand. I love that, that like gnarly posturing. Just Bernie Reichsten and Ghastly Graham Ingalls. If you don't know those two artists, go look at them, especially Ghastly Graham Ingalls. Oh, like, oh my God, he's amazing. Adam, you're just smiling really big. You want to talk about Ghastly Graham Ingalls?
No, but I want to listen to more about it. No, I'm identifying. I love I think your passion to create, but also your passion to educate is coming through really strong.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, no, this is I'm having a great time. Sorry, I've been a little quiet because I'm just like totally enraptured with what you're taking us through right now. So
Thank
please,
you.
please continue. I was just going to say, the other image that comes to mind for me, I mean, it's not overt here. It's probably just kind of showing you where some of my studies have been at of late, but it also, the front, it feels like a reverse blood eagle.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Like, you
yeah.
know what I mean? Like it's that sort of like, why would I ever want my ribs open?
Yeah.
It's very, very vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Oh, that's disturbing. And that is disturbing. I remember seeing a thoracic surgery. Like for some reason there was a channel in the 90s where you could watch surgery. I don't know what it was. There was like a knee surgery that I
Gosh,
always
I know what
run.
you're talking about. Yes.
Yeah, I remember seeing a knee surgery that really disturbed me, and a
Mhm,
thoracic surgery, and that thoracic surgery is intense because it's just like opening up the rib cage. It is like absolutely,
mhm.
um,
I have a very funny story about a relative who was watching his own knee surgery, which he was fascinated with, while listening to very, very heavy industrial music in the 90s. And a
yeah.
person happened to come in off the street asking for help. I think like they needed gas in the car or something. And they knocked on the door opened, and he's in the living room. This imagery is going, the music's going, and they just kind of froze. Like, I came to the wrong house today.
That's amazing. That's so funny. Oh my God, watching his own knee surgery while listening to industrial music.
Yeah, what are you going to do?
Yeah. When I met I had an opportunity back in the 90s to shoot a concert video of a band called the legendary Pink Dots.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember getting an opportunity to tell the legendary Pink Dots the first time I ever heard them. I was on my way to have a root canal. I went to Tower Records and I bought a legendary Pink Dots tape called Shadow Weaver, put it in my Walkman, went in. They put the nitrous oxide on me, started drilling in my mouth while I was listening to the legendary Pink Dots, and they're like, "That's the most amazing introduction to our music ever."
It's fantastic. I love it.
Hmm. So cool, cool. Right. So reading left to right, I felt like it worked much, much better this way. And it's like, okay, that's nice. It gives me a little zigzag here, and the little hand down there. I was really, really. I spent a lot of time getting the hand right, and getting the pose of it, getting the tension in it the way I wanted it. I say right, but nothing's ever right to me, by the way. I've been telling students this lately. I have never liked anything I've done for more than a day. And I finished this about 2 hours before this presentation, so I still kind of like it, but I'm already starting to see everything I want to fix. Tomorrow, be done with it. Be like, just want to see. All I see is what I want to fix. And I think that's valuable for like students to know, because I think I remember as a student, I just assumed that like my instructors, who I just thought were amazing, just thought of themselves as like masters. But every most amazing artist that I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with has all been like, yeah, I mean, I know what I've worked to achieve and what I've worked to learn how to do, but I'm far more concerned with what I don't know. And that's that's it. Like it's better to know what you don't know and like strive for that than to rest on your laurels and be like, I'm great, because that just means you're a jerk. um, so anyway, all right, yeah, the hand. So the hand was feel. I spent a lot of time trying to get the hand feeling right, and I'll show you. I'm gonna lift the curtain and show you the bad stuff that I didn't want to show, so you can see the development of it. I just want to check the time. Oh yeah, we're only an hour in, hour and 10. Perfect. So I'm just gonna talk about a few things here. All right. So of course, silhouette. Everybody's heard of silhouette. First read. Everybody knows, like, and the analogy that I use in class is, you're not supposed to write in all caps on the internet. Does anybody know why? And a lot of times people say, well, that's because it's like shouting. And I was like, and you're not supposed to use all caps in graphic design. And they're like, yeah, yeah. Why? Because it's like shouting. Actually, no. What it is, and this became really apparent to me when I started learning another language. Uh, when you are reading your original language, like I don't get this in French. I still have to read every letter. In English, I'm reading the shape of the word. If you think of the word bed, if you encounter the word bed, you see that on a page, you don't read BED. You see the silhouette and you read the silhouette and your brain knows it's bed. So a lot of reading is the shapes of the words. So if the shapes aren't clear, then like it's all caps. You have to read each individual letter. It slows down your interaction with it. So that's why it's important to think about silhouette and think about the first read. Is you want things to be clear in that silhouette. Luckily, ZBrush has that little silhouette view now, that thumbnail view, which is really handy. Um, I really like having you know that handy. I like just taking my layer, collapsing it, and checking my silhouette to make sure things are reading clearly and there's no weird tangents. Tangents would be if, two things were touching in a way that made them unclear, and I'll show you that in ZBrush in a minute. Um, Also, like visual weight. Now, visual weight can be the space that something actually occupies, or it can be potential space, negative spaces. So this is some negative space up here, and this is some negative space right here, places where we don't have something, and I liked having that counterbalance there. Now, I could have had more negative space down here. That might have worked, might not have. I'd have to try it to see, but it could counterbalance it or throw off the balance. So you want to be thinking about where there is shape and where there is not shape. Um, in calligraphy, um, I was reading a book about writing Hebrew letters, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but it was the phrase was something like the white fire is as important as the black fire, meaning the shape between the strokes that you make. If you're making an aleph or a bet, those shapes are just as important as the shapes inside the letter where there is no stroke. That is as much of a purpose for that letter. Um, so that's that really rang true with me with this stuff, where it's like it's just as important where there is not something. And curves are hugely important, of course. So I'm always thinking about the curves and the lines that flow through this thing. So I spent a lot of time trying to get this curve just right because I wanted it to be very pretty. This to me, she's beautiful to me. They're beautiful to me. I mean, I don't think coronavirus itself is beautiful. It's kind of a pain, although I'm really enjoying spending all this time at home. But I wanted that curvature, so like bringing that leg back was important. This curve here was important. Those are your gesture lines, your main thrust going through the figure. And then there's rhythms. So this, let's flip our image again. Let's look at this. So these were kind of nice. Where let me go back to that color and let me go to a brush. Go back to this layer. So basically, what I was doing here is like, you know, and by the way, this sort of thing, it's not necessarily at the forefront of my mind, but it's in there somewhere. And I think when I first started thinking about stuff like this, like in school, it was probably at the forefront of my mind, but it takes a backseat quickly. So just like check in with yourself every once in a while. Like I said, check in with the basics, check in with the foundations, check in with the form, gesture, proportion, curves, tangents. Think about those things as much as you're thinking about what's this big hooked claw arm gonna look like? It's gonna be so bitchin'. Yeah, of course, it's gonna be that, but also, what are the foundational forms that are making it? So, like, here, like, the rhythms here, I did very specifically say, this rhythms going, "Oops. Oh, there's a real bad delay because I'm broadcasting." So curve, 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 shoop, 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 shoop. So that sort of alternating left, that just all these little elements together build up into something that feels good or profound or intense or pleasing to look at.
Did you sculpt this in pose?
No, I sculpted it for the most part in a neutral position.
Mm-hmm.
Just everything that I knew would be like boating landmarks and stuff like that. I'll show everybody in a minute the how far I took it in a neutral position before I posed it. But once
Okay.
you start posing, you have to keep sculpting, because as soon as something moves, the relationship between the origins and the insertions and the muscles are going to change. I mean, even on something like this, which is it's real bizarre um, creature anatomy. The clavicular head of the pectoralis muscle here is going to be completely different than this one here.
Yeah.
So things like that. The arm is pronated, so the extensors are coming down this way, whereas on this one, the flexors are not. This is supinated. Wait, no, that's pronated as well. So you get your flexors there, but you can't see the extensors. So all this stuff is going to change the relationship. So you start just have to keep sculpting
Mm-hmm.
after you've posed it.
So did you already kind of know what you wanted in terms of the broader gesture because you imagined what pose you wanted it to be in when you're sculpting it? Or did that come as an interaction with some of the other design elements and rhythms you'd put in?
It came. I had a general idea,
Mm-hmm.
and then I had to make it work by changing it. So,
Ah,
um, like for example, if we go over to ZBrush, um, that is. and this is totally lifting the curtain and showing like this is unfinished work. This is where I took it as a neutral pose, just to about here. And I wanted to get things like the hands blocked in. I wanted all those sorts of things blocked in. I wanted bony landmarks blocked in. And then that's as far as I really took it as a symmetrical sculpture because I knew that I was going to pose it. And I had a pretty good idea. And I thought at the time I was going to have one arm back and one arm forward, what I call like a push pull, which is just creates that tension where one part's pulling back and one part's pushing forward. Kind of got that, but brought that hand down. But then that introduced some problems in the composition because then I had to zoom out further for the aspect ratio that I was trying to frame it. So I worked out things like that as I was working, just by looking at it, taking it into Photoshop, being like, I should tweak this. Sometimes I'll cut it apart in Photoshop and just move limbs around, but sometimes not. So it sort of depends on how much time I have. Or if I get like well into something and go, crap, that was not a good idea, I'll just fix it by cutting it apart and then painting it back together. Because the important thing is that that image works and it gets the idea across. And then if you have to go back to the sculpture, you can go back to the sculpture and change that. The important part is to get it into that design meeting, get it seen and get it approved, or get a conversation started around some ideas in it. Here you can see I'm already thinking about the 19. Actually, that's hidden inside the head right now. But all right, so there's where I took it to begin with, and then started sculpting asymmetrically on this one. Select. Why aren't you selecting? Excuse me. There we go. Okay, so then I get to this part here. These little bits here are mesh extractions that I did off the lungs, and then stretched down. I used those to make like goop and goo, but I took them out because they broke up the negative space so much. It didn't work. There's still, I think, some over the lungs, but I didn't end up using those. So let me alt-click on those to select them, and then I'll just hide them. Yeah, that's under lungs. So I'll select the lungs, and we'll get rid of that one. There we go. So then if I go in here, focus in on the lungs, this will be helpful. All right, cool. So you can see my little mesh extraction that I did. I just put a transparent material on that in Keyshot, and then paint the little stringy bits of goo between them in Photoshop later, but I'm going to turn those off. And then you can see some of this stuff is just parts. They're sort of stuck together. So there's those curved bits, those little spiky bits coming off the sides of the rib cage that I felt like they just were a language, an aggressive language. The arm was down like this originally and out a bit, and I liked that because it allowed, I think I've got a previous version here. No, let me see. So this was the once I started sculpting on this, and it wasn't really working because it was very much like kind of this sort of like pillar. Oh wait, I've got this open in Keyshot. That's where I wanted to go. Keyshot. There we go. So this is one of the ones that wasn't working, or this was early in the process. I was like, oh, this is not working. And why is this not working? Well, for a few different reasons. There we go. Come here. Tangency. So there's a tangent there. See how that's interlocking with the collar there? That's not very, very clear. I did have, if I go to my cameras here, I think I had a camera set up like, that one's unlocked. So let me go back down to one of these. Camera 10, for example, I think. There we go. So here's where I was starting to get close. So I didn't have that sort of problem with the tangency there, but it was very much like a pillar. There was no, this just was stiff straight up and down. It didn't feel right. This arm was out, but there was something kind of weak in the hand. It didn't feel like there wasn't tension in there. It just wasn't working for me. I was just like, I didn't like it. I was looking at it. I was like, this doesn't make me feel the way I want it to make me feel. Then I just said, why? And that's something like I will often ask myself, like if I'm painting like something, I'm just like, this doesn't work. Well, I won't just keep putting things down trying to make it work because that doesn't always work. But the best thing to do and the thing that you learn more from, and I always learn from, is if I stop and say, why is this not working? What is it that's wrong? So I stopped and said, okay, this angle here doesn't feel as sort of intense and tension as it could. I fixed the tangent that I had up here that was feeling better, and this just feels like a pillar. So that's why I went back to ZBrush and did this. So I brought one leg back. Let me turn off those extractions again. Turn that off, turn that off.
While you're doing that, I just want to say how immensely valuable this is. It's not always the case that an artist will pull back the curtain
Oh,
in that
thanks.
sense, but
Yeah.
in the I think in the interest of education as well as inspiration, getting to see that is so important. I know I get a lot of time with students that are looking into Gnomon, for example, and they see the student reels and they immediately get intimidated. But
Mhm.
they need to be reminded, like, okay, number one, this is final work. This is what they're using to get a job, and it's post education, right? This is after they, this is what they learned. This isn't what they knew how to do coming in.
Mhm.
But what you're saying about repositioning and reworking a problem and asking why, it's so helpful because I think sometimes when we get frustrated,
Yeah.
it can be so demotivating and
Yeah.
so kind of self-depreciating. But we were talking about this before the stream, asking that question why. I think that's why it's so important to study art history and all these other things and things that might be unrelated, because you need to have that pool you draw off of to answer the question why. It needs to be a deep pool.
Yeah.
And I just love how you're highlighting that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. It's like I I was very fortunate that my mentor in school was very like we got to be good friends, and we actually went to Florence together. And he said, he would be quite honest with, as an artist, how much he would doubt his own abilities, and how much he would be afraid to like reveal how much he really worked to make things the way he wanted them to look. And to us, he was an absolute genius. He was amazing. And hearing that from someone that I looked at and thought everything he did, he just like made solid gold. He's like, no, I spent a lot of time working this stuff out. And like, he lifted back the curtain. He showed me like layer after layer of vellum over this drawing where he had worked out different ideas, gotten something and then put it down on the Bristol board. And I was like, I thought you just put that down as it was. He's like, no, I work for it. And it is really easy to look at the stuff and look at the final pieces and be disheartened. But the journey is the reward. And there's nothing like that. Like you said, that dopamine hit of when it works. You're like, I got that
Right.
thing. Got it.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. And it's like when you're first going into school, or like when people take my intro class, I tell them first class, by the end of this class, you're going to be an intermediate ZBrush user. You're going to look back at what you did at the beginning and be shocked at how far you've come. And they're always a little bit, dubious. And then at the end, they're like, "Oh my God, I came so far." I was like, "Yeah, you
Mhm.
don't realize it when you're doing it, but you get there. Really, you get there. You get there." And you know, we've only got so much time. There's a amazing quote by Longfellow, and it's on the cover of an Andrew Loomis book. It's where I first heard it. I bought a first edition of the Figure Drawing for All It's Worth back in like
Yeah.
2001, and but they're impossible to find now. They've been reprinted now, thankfully. But or I think it was Creative Illustration, one of the two. But the boards of the book says, "Art is long and time is fleeting."
Ooh, that's good.
Isn't that good?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, Loomis he's talk about a Bible
Hmm.
for figure drawing. Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is what I did. So then I was thinking about, and you know what? I'm not even going to step up the subdivision levels in this because the details don't matter. The details don't matter. This is the stuff I'm looking at right here. Ooh, I can't get that big enough. Let me zoom in a little bit. Like, this is the stuff that I'm thinking about when I was working on this. I wasn't so much concerned with how the skin was wrinkling, although I did want to think about the pull of the skin where the thumb was coming back and stretching the skin there. But I was thinking about like the angle here at the carpals, and the metacarpals, the angle there, that line, that angle there. I was thinking about that sort of thing. I was thinking in these terms here, trying to get that to work. Um, and make me feel the way I wanted it to make me feel when I looked at it. Also did some real subtle turns in the head, just to make sure that the 19 was not dead center, but wasn't so much off center that you couldn't read it as 19. That it wouldn't be. I didn't want it to be something that was confusing. Actually, that's the wrong angle. Let me go back to Photoshop. Uh, I didn't want it to be confusing to the point that it took you too long to sort of process it when you were looking at it. So that was like a consideration. But I didn't want it to be head on. I didn't want it to be right there because then that would just grab your eye immediately because it's a word or it's a letter. Like that would just pull your eye right to it immediately. Um, so yeah. So that's like kind of the process that I was going through with that up until about 2 hours ago. um, I think there's other things that we can talk about with that. Mm, yeah, I think we've touched on most of that. So I'm going to go back over to my slides because there's.
Just on that piece in particular, there was one question that came in. They just wanted to know overall about how much time did you put into this particular piece.
I did most of it live, where you can go to my blog and look at the COVID Demoni ZBrush live streams. Those were about 3 hours each, so 3, 6, 9 hours. Then probably 3 hours where I just worked on it when I wasn't on camera because it was hard to do. Like, it was hard to ideate on camera. So 3 hours on top of that, so 9, 10, 11, 12, and then 14 hours, I guess.
Okay, yeah,
Something like
yeah.
that. Yeah. To this point here. Yeah. Um,
Oh, guys, I should say, keep your questions coming into the chat. A little in a bit, we'll take some concerted time to kind of look at some of the questions that have been coming
yeah.
through. So, please feel free to type your questions. We will be doing our best to address all of them.
So then we'll talk about the Bogey Lady. Bogey Lady is like just a fun little personal thing I've been working on. From ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night, good Lord deliver us. Traditional Scottish proverb. That's a real thing too. I love that. And so the idea around the Bogey Lady. So I should probably show you like some of the sketches. Well, I'll show you that afterwards. So well, here, I will just go over here. So the Bogey Lady, this is how she was born. Like I said in my like drawing in my sketchbook or drawing in Procreate before I go to bed. Just thinking, I think this is the first one here. I was just doodling and I was like, oh, that's kind of fun. And then I was like doodling that one. And then it got to be, well, like something that had 2 elbows and 2 knees. That would be real like really weird to see that in motion. And so I got to thinking about that. And it's like the idea behind the Bogey Lady is like this the childhood fears, because like there's the bogeyman or the boogeyman. And the boogeyman, then there must be a boogie lady. So the bogey lady is the childhood fears can be nonsensical and comedic, but this contradistinction between the irrational and the horrible is really evocative. So, like, if you imagine this long, leggedy lady in a ragged floral print dress living in your closet, she has 2 elbows and 2 knees and goes knuckling and knocking around the room after midnight. I think that's creepy. I think she's sweet. I think she's lovely and probably just wants a hug. And I find the dress kind of sad. Yeah, actually. Mhm. Yeah, 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 absolutely. And so I was sort of like doodling around that, thinking around that, what that might be, and I thought she's been a lot of fun to work on. And sorry, I've got to pull up my slide navigator on my other screen. Yeah, so things that I pulled into with the Bogey Lady. Um, by the way, I know that we got I think we're down to like 30 minutes. So if I run into our question time, feel free to stop me so we can we can do questions. I don't want to go just keep going if you know run over. Mhm. Okay. Okay. Cool. All right. So here we go. Bogey lady. She's got these little long eyelashes. I thought that was pretty. I also like the fact that, and I spent a lot of time trying to decide if I wanted to give her a grimace on the center eyes, because if you cover those, the others are almost calf-like or like bovine. Like they almost look like there's something gentle in the other eyes. Like if you cover these, but those in the center have this sort of grimace to them. And I spent a lot of time trying to decide if I wanted to do that or not. Um, things that I was pulling from. So there's so Bogey Lady. I wanted to play around with some, and I think this was floating around in my head, so it just ended up in there. Baphomet. Um, so it's an illustration from the 19th century by Eliphas Levi. It's from a book called High Magic. He was an occultist, and the Baphomet. You know, you've seen the Baphomet. It's really kind of entered into the collective consciousness through the statues and movies. I think Sabrina has the Sabrina TV show had a Baphomet in it. So that's sort of a little bit on the top, and obviously Baphomet is pulling from like fertility imagery and imagery of like this like hermaphroditic kind of creature. So there's all sorts of strange chimeric hybrid sort of things happening there. And also like I'll just I'll say it. Somebody finally on Instagram said, "Well, that looks like a uterus." I was like, "Well, yeah, that was intentional." So I was I had been reading Barbara Creed, and I was thinking about like how so many like monsters to me often seem like they represent signifiers that are coded for the feminine or femininity or women's reproductive bodies or women existing in the world in general. And I thought it would be really interesting to take that and deliberately undermine it and sort of be like confrontational or to poke at it. And so that bit of language was actually intentional because like I don't want people in the chat now to be like, oh no, social justice but or feminism or whatever, but whatever. I think that there's some truth to this notion that like things, and when I say things that are coded as like things that we look at and interpret as being feminine or female, um, can be both cherished by society or desired by society, but also simultaneously punished. And I thought that that was a very, very interesting notion. And then, because I had been reading Barbara Creed and I was thinking about that, that's one of the places that Bogey Lady came out of. She's quite. I was showing her, talking to a friend of mine about it, and my friend, she's like, "Wow, I really like that notion of how she's full of she said, "Bogey Lady's full of teeth. Trouble her not, lest she terrify thee." Which I thought that was a lovely turn of phrase. Um, so the idea it was sort of thinking around those things, like thinking around the idea of how many problems as far as the culture comes, how many problems we still have around sort of notions of misogyny and notions of like baked in sort of gender inequality. And this is something I've seen, like I remember I was working, I won't say what studio I was at, I won't say what movie I was on, but I was working on a biblical epic. I won't say what denomination, but I was doing a painting of one of the bad guys because I always do the bad guys. And something in my painting read as the stance and the figure just read as like quote effeminate to the director. And I was just basically trying to make the character feel aristocratic and of a sort of very refined demeanor. And it struck me that he looked at it and said, "Wow, that's really that character looks really effeminate. I like that. Let's make the bad guy really effeminate." And I was like, "Wow, that's such a trope, isn't it? Like how interesting that gets pulled out and that gets taken and used. And so it's like Bogey Lady is kind of based around some of those things. There's the irrational childhood fears, but it's also a tinkering with and an interrogation of and sort of playing around with why do these shapes disturb you? Why are why do these things upset you? And why are what is it about potential spaces? What is it about you know I don't want to keep it all PG-13 as much as possible, but I think you get what I'm saying. Um, and that's not something that I usually like. I usually bowdlerize myself, and I don't talk about these sorts of things in very explicit detail. I usually just let them sort of sit out there in the room for people who can pick up on them. But I thought it might be worth talking about it because there's a it's culturally significant, and it's like it's important to be aware of how our prejudices are baked into our consciousness and how we enact them, or how our ideas around what a monster is sometimes comes from a really interesting and strange place. And I think if you are aware of that consciously, you can be empowered by it, and you can change it, and you can use it in your favor. Because, like I said, monsters have never scared me. Monsters don't scare me. They've always been my friends, and every single monster that I've ever made, for the most part, I've always tried to connect to with some kind of emotional element. I've always felt I wanted to feel something from them. Um, it could be wonder, it could be awe, it could be fascination, but it's never disgust and it's never fear. And I think a lot of creature sort of design people kind of feel the same way around that. So yeah, if you're interested in that sort of thing, like I said, the Barbara Creed book is a great sort of like leaping off point. Um, it's there's a lot to be said around those sorts of ideas and those sorts of questions, and the way certain things are coded in society and the way society pushes back against them. So I think we're coming up on question time. I don't. Oh, I could show one more thing, but no, no, no. Let me go ahead. Go. No, no, no. Ah, yeah. Let me get out of presentation mode. Uh, mhm, yeah, yeah. Mhm, mm, thanks, thanks. Yeah, I've never I always kind of feel like there doesn't have to be a huge sort of difference between fine art and the philosophical and emotional questions around fine art and the commercial art we do as designers. If I think we do our audience and ourselves a disservice if we try and divorce those two things from one another. Things can be far more profound if you let them be. And you now whether or not that ends up on screen is another thing.
Well, yeah, but
Yeah,
sometimes I think the process and the journey that got to the screen has an influence,
yeah,
uh, whether we see it or not.
yeah. So Bogey Lady, you can see me sculpting live on screen if you go to my blog.
Yeah,
There's a and this is where it ends on that live stream. And the last thing I wanted to say is like once again pulling back the curtain. It's like so I got to this point and I was looking at it and when I finally was able to sort of like not be talking about it while I was working and be able to revisit. So I was looking at things like for example, I should probably actually step up the subdivision levels on this one so it can be seen. Oh, it already is. I'm only at 3. So I was looking at none of these shapes felt right. I liked the gravity here. I liked the weight. I liked the sag, but nothing felt like it really had structure underneath it. It didn't feel like there was anything happening. Like the shapes weren't fitting together nicely. So I deliberately went in and fixed that. Hopefully. Hopefully. Yeah, let me turn off poly paint on this. There we go. So if you look at the difference, so this is where my mind went when I was able to revisit her. Um, so there's that, which doesn't really have the sense of this sort of structure of this cheekbone, the zygomatic bone, these eye stalks. By the way, these eye stalks are asymmetrical. One of them is kind of looking up at a slightly different angle than the other, so that was intentional. But here I've thought about these volumes and these shapes and how they wedge into one another. Like this wedges into this. Another really important thing for me was this shape here and this shape here, these two wedging together, and then the sorts of rhythms of the sagging skin. But the value, remember what I was saying about value and relative value? The value of this shadow here is going to be darker than these here because this shape is higher than these. Like, there's two ways to think about sculpture. You can think about it, and I think it's best to think about them both simultaneously. This is sticking out further, so it's going to cast a darker shadow. But that also means that the values that you're reading, it's going to change their value relationship. So this is going to be a darker value than this. So I liked that. And the other one, it was just all the same value. Yeah. So yeah, and then I brought the shoulders forward as well. I wanted this sort of slumped forward, almost like the structure of like a bear, which I bring them even further forward when I pose. And I do a lot of sculpting once something's in pose, things get finished there. So I added her chest muscles, her breasts, these little spiny hairs, which aren't terribly important. That's just fiber mesh. Let me turn those off. And the eyelashes, of course. So we'll turn off the eyelashes and the hair. There we go. And so I slung the shoulders forward, and I was sculpting to the pose, but also sculpting to the angle as well, because I knew that I was going to be viewing the character like this. I also deliberately turned the head on an angle so we could have a really strong diagonal going through there, because that's such a T shape. If it was just bisecting the picture plane, it wouldn't have been nearly as interesting as tilting it like this and getting that really strong diagonal. So, yeah, that that's the process of the bogey lady so far. She's still going. I'll keep working on her because I quite like her. I want to do a full figure. So
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that. All right. So yeah, we've had some great questions come in on the chat. So we're gonna start hitting these as best we can. Let me just kind of head back up to the top of my list here. All right. Yes, and I'm coming through because some of them you've actually addressed in process. They came in earlier. You've taken care of that. Here's a question from Brandon Brown. Your earlier comment on shapes, as you do a lot of creature work, how do you go about deciding, deciding the shape of form or details? In other words, your shape decisions. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I'm very early in the process thinking about abstractions, and like I might, like if I'm thumbnailing on my sticky notes, which I highly recommend, because invariably, I mean, you could start things in ZBrush, and I start things in ZBrush all the time, or I start things in Photoshop. But if you thumbnail it first, it just makes a big difference. I'll put down some like abstract shapes, like all the time in Procreate. I'll put down scribbles and then find something out of the scribbles. And I found ways to do that in ZBrush, where I'll just start pushing and pulling a polysphere or a sphere around in Dynamesh mode, and then try and hit it with the clay tubes brush, and then start looking for shapes. But I go back to things that I learned in school from books like this. Like I think about balance and contrast and rhythm. I think about, like, for example, the image on screen right now. You've got that oval shape with the two bits coming off the sides and offset at an angle with another oval for her torso. I mean, I'm not thinking about it consciously per se, but there was a time that I was, and it's in the back of my head, so it's in there. So if you're just trying to like get your head around it, I would just like get a big chisel tip marker and make big bold shapes and look at what they look like together and try and pick out a couple shapes that work nicely together, like two, three, and then change their proportion to or their ratios to one another, and then say I'm going to make something out of this, and then make something out of that. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And then we've got a I can't quite make out the chat name, but next question. Just wondering what kind of software you're normally using when you start to lay in your texturing.
Um, I just poly paint, and Photoshop on top of that. So I'll poly paint. If I was painting like texture map, paint Mari or Substance Painter. But for the most part, it's Photoshop and poly paint.
And then let's see, Andrew Watson. I want to do character modeling, but can't go to school right now. So how would I be able to self-teach? For example, with Gnomon workshops and starting in with Ray's anatomy. They're working with anatomy and they're doing some Gnomon workshops, and they're wondering kind of what's the next best place for them to go after anatomy.
Well, I wouldn't do too much. I wouldn't rely on Grey's Anatomy too much. Grey's Anatomy is intended for surgeons, and usually the ones that you find are quite old online. The best book that you can get, well, there's a couple, but if I had to pick one anatomy book, it would be Goldfinger's Human Anatomy for Artists, which is so important to me. I've had 5 copies of it already in my life, and I've got it within easy reach. It's this book. Go to my blog. I wrote a post about it. It's the last Maddie Monster Library post. I'll show you images from it, and there's a link there where you can go to Amazon and get it. It's about $50, and it's worth it. It shows the muscle origins and insertions. So if I had it to do over again and I could go back in time and tell young me what to do, I would say stop obsessing over every individual muscle. Learn the origin and insertions of the big ones, where they originate from and where they insert, and learn the big shapes. Less expensive, but absolutely invaluable. George Bridgman, also within easy reach. George Bridgman is going to be incredible because he's not going to get you locked up in muscle names or individual muscles. He's going to show you big shapes, the thoracic mass, and how the thoracic mass wedges into the abdominal mass or the pelvis. That's more important than every individual muscle, which you'll get from Grey's Anatomy. Plus, you're going to get deep layer stuff and things that just aren't going to apply really at all. So you can get every book George Bridgman ever wrote for like $20 in one big omnibus, and they're wonderful. So I would get Bridgman and if you can get the Goldfinger book, and Gnomon workshop videos are great. Get a sketchbook, do lots of doodling. Don't have to show it to anybody, and there's so many options online. Like if you want to learn to model. I mean, for the most part, that's sculpting these days. Like most of the time, and I've got a couple friends who get really mad at me for saying this, but you can project meshes. Like most of the time, people take like Wrap 3 and then they'll like project an archetype mesh onto a sculpture. So I would spend as much time as possible learning to sculpt, either in ZBrush or in clay. And I wouldn't, if you want to be a modeler, I wouldn't go out there not knowing how to lay out a base mesh, but I would spend as much time as I possibly could learning how to sculpt. And then, because topology isn't really all that hard, but people can become preoccupied with it, and I think burn a lot of time that could be better spent on sculpting, because inevitably there's going to come a point where topology will be laid out by AI or something, but AI is not going to sculpt for you, hopefully. So I don't know. I don't want to make it seem like I'm downplaying the importance of topology, but it's like art is long and time is fleeting. Like, do you want to put points down in space, or do you want to like sculpt like form? Like, focus in on the sculpting, because the topology stuff there's the topology guides website that's really good for learning about edge flow, and there's a couple really good Gnomon workshop videos that talk about laying out an edge flow. But I think, yeah, I mean, I'm biased too because I love to sculpt, and I don't particularly enjoy the technical aspects of things quite so much. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. Is another question from Michael Campbell. Thanks for the stream. I was wondering if Madeline has tried sculpting in any VR programs such as Medium, and what you think of VR sculpting as it relates to the future.
I tried it at my last job. They had a setup. It was really cool, but it hurt my neck. It felt a lot like Freeform, which I used to use, which is the robot arm that would attach. It had haptic feedback, where like this would be this little robot arm you were holding and sculpting, and you could kind of touch the form because there'd be force feedback. It felt a little bit like that because everybody who used that at Gentle Giant ended up with a repetitive stress injury in their shoulder because you're holding your arm up like that. So it was like the heaviness of the helmet was a bit weird, but I liked it, and I think it's the future. And Geo, if you're watching, hook me up. Send me the setup. I'll do some VR sculpting. I would
Nice.
love to do it. I would love to do it. I don't. I'm not set up to do it, but I enjoyed it when I did it. When I tested it out at my last job, and it's definitely the future. It's absolutely the future. I don't believe that the 2D interface into 3D is going to be around for that much longer. We're going to be interactively sculpting and painting. Absolutely, probably. And I said this the other day that I've been through three sculptural revolutions. The haptic feedback one with Freeform. Shortly after that, ZBrush, and the next one's going to be VR sculpting. That's the next like sculptural revolution that's coming, and it's coming soon. It's like 5 years, 10 maybe. So yeah, I love it. I want to do more of it, but I'm just not set up for it. You know, I am. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. I know also. Uh, what's the name of the software? You've got Medium, and then you've also got one that's a little bit more working with topology and whatnot. I'm sure somebody in the chat will think of it, but they're awesome tools right now. They're really great tools. But yeah, definitely there's things that you can't do there that you can do in ZBrush for sure.
Yeah.
But it's really cool to get in a 3D environment, actually, like spin
Yeah.
what you're working on around stuff. Let's see.
It's really nice to go like to have the things that I used to like have just as a matter of course, like moving my light around by hand, or like,
Oh
you know,
yeah.
looking around the object, leaning around the object, but also having the benefit that we have in ZBrush where you can like sculpt something from the underside without getting down on the ground and looking up at it. Like I
Mm-hmm.
used, that's really nice. Sorry, go on. You were asking
Oh
another
yeah, no,
question.
let's just move into the next question. So let's see here. Hi, I'd like to know what Madeline thinks about. Oh, okay. So they asked about VR, which we already addressed. But asking about, and inevitably, Blender always comes up in our events and in the chats. A lot of people using Blender, and it's a great way to learn 3D. Have you messed around with any of the sculpting features in Blender? Do you have any experience with that?
Mm, no, I got Blender so I could open up images from Sketchfab from the Global Heritage Project because a lot of them come down as Blender files, which is great. If you haven't subscribed to that, you should. Their mission is to scan every great piece of art and um, uh, artifact of human culture so it's safe because people are awful everywhere around the world and things are always in danger at some point.
Mm-hmm.
So they're scanning all of it and making it available online so you can find like beautiful sculptures of like um, Augustus Caesar and like Paleolithic rock art and stuff like that. So anyway, but Blender, yeah, no, I haven't used the sculpting tools. I used 3D Coat years ago. I enjoyed that, but I usually just work in ZBrush. I can if I need to work in another program, I can. And I hear lots of good things about Blender. Like people really are vocal about how much they like it. But I get most of what I need just from Photoshop and ZBrush.
Yeah. I've got an interesting question that's come in. And I'm curious to know the answer. Do you ever get nightmares from your work?
No, no, my nightmares are very banal. My nightmares are things like I have robbed a bank and I realize that I'm screwed. I've just robbed a bank. And I'm like, I've ruined my life. Why did I rob a bank? And then I wake up and go, I'm really glad I didn't rob a bank. No. Like I wish I had like really amazing nightmares, but no, I don't get nightmares. None of this stuff, none of it scares me. It's not grotesque to me. It's beautiful and it's I love them. I love monsters. They're my friends.
Let's see. Did you? Let's see. Sorry, the font size of the chat's a bit small, so I'm just zeroing in on it. Did you ever make a monster for a game or a movie? And how did you get that idea? Oh, okay, I think the question is having to do with designing a monster and making it fit within a particular world, right? Thinking of the larger
Mm.
picture.
Mm.
How do you approach that?
That's a really important thing, like, and having your own style, but also being able to work in someone else's style, which is not talked about a lot, but it's important. Like, um, I worked on, um, I worked on a show that was inspired by French or Belgium comic books, BD, which had like a lot, like so the illustration style. The art director said it was like carved butter or like carved clay. Like there were very plainer elements to it. Not something that I usually did at all. And I had to design characters and a couple monsters for that world, and that was a really specific type of language. So I immersed myself in it really quickly. I went and looked up a bunch of stuff online, did mood boards, and I looked at the images. And when I looked at the image, I asked myself, what connects these images? Like you can't just make a mood board and be like, that's a bunch of stuff that's inspiring. Like I feel like you have to be that guy in that meme image that's got all the lines on the wall around all the different things, and it's like this means something. But like
Yes.
you look at all those images, it's like what connects these? Like what connects these? So I remember pulling down a bunch of that art and looking at it and saying like what unifies these styles together? Because I need to be able to do this next week, and so that's how I did that, and also asking if they had a clear like color palette, if they had a clear sort of ethos or design language that they were working with, which they did, which was he was explaining that when he laid that out about the Belgian comic books. I hadn't even been exposed to that stuff before. I'd seen a lot of French illustrators when I was far too young to be reading Heavy Metal magazine. And I was. Heavy Metal was an amazing. I don't know if it's still around. It was amazing. Uh, it's not a comic book. It was like 2000 AD in the UK. It was like sequential art, Judge Dredd kind of stuff, but they were like very adult themed and very, very kind of interesting. But I'd seen some of the like French illustrators in in there, but I had never been exposed to this specific type of style. And I can't remember the word for it. There was a word for it, but I've lost it. Maybe if Adam knows, I don't know. But that's how I approached that.
Hmm. We've got another viewer who wants to know what part of the process do you start sculpting asymmetrically?
As soon as possible these days. Um, I mean, I'll turn off symmetry usually when I get towards the center of the face really early on, because there's no need to make anything symmetrical there other than the bony structure. Even the wings of the nostrils, or the nose, I'll make asymmetrical a little bit. Um, it was so funny, like being a sculptor, you had to work really hard to get things symmetrical, and now you have to work really hard to make sure things have asymmetry. And I found that if I put the asymmetry in later, it felt intentional. There was an intentionality, and it just didn't feel right. But if I just went ahead and started making things asymmetrical from the beginning, it was fine. It worked a lot better. Little tiny differences can make a big difference. It can also be a headache for people too. So, but
Hmm.
yeah.
Especially that uncanny valley of when it just looks too symmetrical, it could be a perfect face, but
Mhm.
the brain rejects it.
Yeah.
All right, let's see here. We just finished the asymmetry. Oh, well, it's an interesting question. Is it necessary right now, or in the near future, for all concept artists to know some 3D? I think I've got definitely opinions about that, but I'd really like to hear what you have to say.
In the film industry, yes. The art department has changed. My last art director, actually, this quote from him. Art department has changed drastically in the past 10 years, 5 years even. So yes, if you want to be in film, I do think you really need to understand 3D. I think it helps also to know to have some experience in virtual art department. Like a lot of art department now is on it's almost its own pipeline where things are going all the way through to like model and groom and stuff, and going into like Unreal. Like that's a thing. But that doesn't mean that being able to paint or draw isn't important. Being able to sculpt, like you still need to be able to, like, the most important thing is that you get ideas, and you have ideas, and you can communicate them clearly, and you can realize someone else's artistic brief. Like, that's really important, being able to interpret what someone's telling you, because, like, working for Guillermo del Toro, he can tell you exactly what he wants in specific terms. Like, he can say, like, Guillermo would say, like, God, he would say, like, he'd reference Ghastly Graham Ingalls and Jules Peter Witkin, and yeah, like that. He used to be like, that's a bit Jules Peter Witkin, that's a bit Crepuscular. I remember Crepuscular came up at one point. Like, those, he's being really specific, and he's giving you so much information to work with. Other people won't be that specific. Other people will be like, yeah, it's like nothing you've ever seen before. Like, that's a joke. That, like, it's always like, that's actually in scripts all the time. You get to the monster and it's like nothing we've ever seen before. Okay, but then most of the time it ends up turning out to be something you've already seen before, because they're like, can we make it look more like Predator? Can we make it look more like 300 or whatever? But I mean, like, but being able to interpret an artistic brief, that's really important too. Like, so being able to realize an artistic brief for somebody. But yeah, 3D is really, really important, at least in like film. In film, it's definitely important, which is funny because, like, in 2006, when I started my career after going to school, after being a makeup effects artist, going to school, then going out into the industry, I had to push really hard for people to understand ZBrush as a maquette tool. Like, it was like, I used to do clay sketches, and that was fine, but then I put up something that's sculpted in ZBrush. Like, no, 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 we don't want a model yet. I was like, well, it's not really a model. It's a maquette. It's like, we're not into the modeling phase yet. People really felt like once they were seeing something that was in 3D, they were too far down the line. They wanted to see something else. And I got around that by starting to paint over stuff, which was fun anyway, because I wanted to be painting, and I could get some things out quicker just by painting on top of them, and also changing the presentation, making things feel a little bit more gestural, a little bit looser. But over time now, like, everybody seems to understand, like, a ZBrush sculpt is a conceptual phase. And also people really understand the concept. I always say concept happens up until the point that it's on the Blu-ray. Like, it's still in development all the way through the pipeline. So things are being further developed as it goes along, and changed, hopefully for the better.
Mm-hmm. And it's such a cool time too, I think, to use 3D. The tools have come along so far that it doesn't have to take you out of that intuitive artistic flow.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's just more really really cool stuff that you can do as an artist.
You guys
Um,
should go check out Alex Nice. He's I think I think he teaches at Gnomon. I think he's got a DVD, or Gnomon DVD. I'm
mhm.
showing my age. But he just put up a post on his Facebook and his Instagram of the design for the Snowpiercer train that he did up in 3D. I
Yeah,
think he did, and it's so cool. He worked out so much stuff in there. I love seeing that people, you know, concept artists using 3D to create, to be more specific about what they're trying to get across. Like, when Timeline first came out in ZBrush, a friend of mine at a workshop used it to design a creature's mouth, and the way it would open in a real specific way, and a certain thing would come out. I have to be really vague with it, but, like, he wasn't really a Maya user or anything, but that opened up that door for him to be able to explain something exactly the way he wanted to explain it. That you could only, with a series of paintings, you could show so much, but he could show exactly what he meant from every different angle, and he really loved that. So, sorry, Adam,
yeah.
I cut you off. Go on.
Oh no, no, you didn't at all.
Okay.
All right, so just a few more questions here. It's all really fun stuff to talk about. All right.
I could talk about this stuff all night.
Oh yeah, yeah. Um, when it comes to conception, what do you think is something? Hang on, just deciphering the question here really quick. Oh, what's something when it comes to concepting? What's something that a lot of artists might overlook? That's something that can really make or break a piece.
Composition, yeah, the presentation, especially if they're working in 3D. is being so preoccupied with the sculpting and the modeling that they just throw a light on it and render it, and they don't think about things like losing edges. They don't think about like, losing an edge here, losing that's edge is carved out by a little bit of rim light. That's lost down there. This is lost in here. Not everything has to be described exactly. Not everything has to be visible. Um, Not taking a lot of time and care in the angles and the curves, the things I was talking about. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. I spend more time presenting this piece. Like I probably, well, not more time than, yeah, maybe I might have spent more time like thinking about exactly how I was going to light it and pose it and present it than worrying about the sculpting, the anatomy and the pose. I think I got that dialed in pretty quickly, and then
Mhm.
most of it was me trying to tweak that to the presentation view. So like presentation is a big thing, and lighting is a big thing. Like you said something really great earlier, Adam, about someone who had been on here talking about the old masters and what they learned from the old masters lighting for their digital work.
Yeah,
Um,
Ian Spriggs,
yeah,
big student of art history for those purposes. I think the flip side of that coin is that you can spend so much time in composition. It's not like you have just a static 2D image that you either have to repaint, but you can take the time to turn the camera and turn the forms and move the light and make all these beautiful discoveries.
yeah,
And there's a few happy accidents in there as well that you can find. So it's just more amazing stuff that you can do as a creative
yeah,
using that process. Let's see.
definitely.
Um,
There's
oh, you go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, I often find too that you can sometimes run into what I call option paralysis, where you have so many options you don't know what to do. So sometimes what I'll do, because I only render in Keyshot because I just don't want to fuss with anything else,
Mhm.
and I like Keyshot. So I'll get a couple I'll make a bunch of cameras, and then early on I'll look at those angles, I'll look at those focal lengths, I'll look for the tangents, I'll try and pick the thing that works. I'll also change my aspect ratio because this one Covid Demoni started out landscape because those arms were spread out so much. And I tried and tried, and it didn't. I was like, something doesn't feel right. And then I changed it to portrait, and it starts like, oh, okay, okay. Changed my aspect ratio, and then I narrowed my cameras down. And then once I get my cameras narrowed down, then I take away all the light. I make it black. I go to a black environment, and then I put a rim light in. The first thing I do is this light right there. That's the most important to me because it defines that character from the background. It
Mhm.
describes so much while it's obliterating detail. And if you get that, and then make sure that your other values don't hit necessarily that value, show you a cool trick. Everybody, this is really cool. If you are having a hard time seeing your values, and this is amazing. This is such a fun trick. Go to the top of your layer stack. Go to layer, uh, new adjustment layer, hue saturation. Click OK, and then take your saturation all the way down. Okay, now go to layer, new adjustment layer, posterize. Posterize is going to limit your values. So let's say OK to that, and then we're going to set our posterize levels to 4. There we go. I'll take these two, shift click, group them together. Now I'll turn them off. And at any point as I'm working, and I do this a lot because I will go in a lot of times and like hand model and paint on things, and that can change my values because I'm putting color down on top, and that can knock the value back, and I can throw off my value distribution. So if I want to check it, I just turn this layer on. I'm like, okay, cool. There's my brightest bright, brightest bright. There's my midtone. There's my shadow, and I can see the distribution of value very clearly through my image. And if anything, like if I didn't have these midtones down here, or I didn't have highlights down here, I would see it immediately. And it's very hard, I think, to sometimes see that in color. To see color and value at the same time is tricky. I mean, there's like, yeah. So that's just a neat trick that I use that I thought you guys might
Great.
like. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. So we just have a few more questions here. Thanks for sticking around with us just a little bit longer.
My
Appreciate
pleasure. I love doing this. Ask
it.
all the questions.
Awesome. All right. Let's see here. When you can say you feel more comfortable with sculpting in symmetry and then switching to pose rendering without, let's see, without feeling you drop the symmetry to pose too soon. I guess they're trying to decipher kind of when at the point that you feel comfortable when you switch to um, beginning to pose and things like that, like the relationship between sculpting with your pose and keeping your symmetry and those kind of things. That's the best way that I can understand the question.
So if I mean, a lot of it can depend on like what I know I'm gonna have to do with it. So like, let's say, like in a perfect world, I'll start posing something pretty early if I know I'm gonna be presenting it in pose. I present everything in pose, but I'll start posing pretty early because like there's no point other than sculpting your bony landmarks, establish all the bony landmarks because those are gonna move and stay in relation to one another for the most part. Um, I establish those in my overall volumes and shape relationships, and then I'll start posing and sculpting asymmetrically. And I don't even use, usually don't use pardon me, what's it called? Posable symmetry in ZBrush. I usually don't even bother with that. I will on a face maybe, but if I'm like trying to make a change to cheekbones or something, but I'll do it pretty early in a perfect world. But sometimes things have to, it kind of depends on where it's going to eventually end up going. Like if I need to be really careful and make sure that I keep things symmetrical and I can always get back to the original pose, I will store that pose as a layer, or I might, if I'm under like a lot of time constraints, just say I'll deal with that if it gets approved, and then go back to it and be like, oh crap, I've got to make this symmetrical now. Which I can sometimes do. Like I'm really lifting the hood now. Sometimes I'll take a thing, pose half of it symmetrically again, and then cut it in half and mirror it, and then make it asymmetrical again and remesh it so I've got something that's symmetrical if I'm in a bind. Like it's hard. I can always get it back to something symmetrical if I have to, but if it's an idea, like if it's something like some of the work I've shown you, usually that I have about 2 days, 3 days to do something, and yeah, it may or may not go anywhere, so it's not worth trying to spend a lot of time keeping things symmetrical and clean. I'll dynamesh stuff, remesh it, move it around, and then if it gets approved, then I'll worry about getting it symmetrical and delivering it to virtual art department.
It's one of the things I love about people who have spent time working in traditional media is, I think those of us who see certain limitations with a digital setup and, what do I do? And I've painted myself into a corner here. All the artists I know who have worked traditionally, they're like, that's okay. It's way more flexible than you think it is. And they'll just hack it up and move it around and repaint it or whatever. And,
Mm-hmm.
they really take command over what's happening. And I think that's really
Yeah.
cool. All
When I
right.
teach painting, like when I teach people how to paint skin textures, like I always say, like I use layers in Photoshop and I'll use layers in Mari. But like in ZBrush, I don't use layers when I'm painting because I learned to paint with an airbrush. I learned to paint on silicone and foam latex, and you don't have layers. And you make a mistake, you paint through it. And I realized early on there's a lot of value in painting through your mistakes because you learn what the mistake was and you learn how to fix it. And so I always encourage people in my class when I do the class on painting creature skins, paint through your mistakes. Don't use layers. You can always use layers later, but you spend all this time futzing around with a layer opacity, it's there's diminishing returns there. Now, obviously, in a pipeline, like I use them in Photoshop and I use them, but I collapse them a lot in Photoshop actually, and I use them in Mari. But I think there's so much value to just like fixing it. Because if you fix your mistakes by Control Z or by turning layers on and off, I don't think you learn as much as if you go, yeah, you know what, that just got like that value got really, really unappealing. There's no contrast there. I need to go in and bring in some lights or push in some darks. Or that just became really muddy. I need to look at my color contrast and decide what I'm going to do with that. I need to I need to put a warm next to this cool, or I need to mottle on top of this area that's gotten very, very chalky and ugly. So making conscious decisions based on the mistakes you've made to fix them is a really good way of learning. And those of us that came up through like traditional media had no choice. and we love being able to use undos and layers, but also I think it's robbed some people of a learning opportunity that they didn't know that they could even have.
Yeah, precisely. All right, so I think we're down to our last question. So thank you, everybody, for all your questions you put in the chat. This comes from Ethan Lacombe. What are your recommendations for approaching and improving your figure drawing?
Um, do lots and lots of it. Don't worry about it sucking, because everything you ever do, you'll probably look at and think, ah, it could be better, and that's good. Do more of it. Do it while you're like sitting there watching Netflix or something. Like pause, draw what you see on screen. Also, like there, I feel that there's three different ways to approach figure drawing. There is, and this is, this is just my particular take on it. And I would pick one that you feel really good about and work on that. I picked one, and then I do all three, but I picked one early on because I was like, this makes sense to me. Because I was a sculptor. I was naturally drawn to sculpture, and I was not as naturally drawn to figure drawing because, and one of my drawing instructors pointed this out, he said, you draw like a sculptor. You're trying to draw around the figure. You have to realize that you're seeing the figure from one view. And so draw through it. Draw with the Renaissance Michelangelo style where you're drawing volumes. Draw those volumes and interlock those volumes, and that's going to fix that problem for you. And it was a huge aha moment because it did. I was no longer thinking about unwrapping a 3D volume on the plane. I was seeing through it and drawing the volumes. That might appeal to you as a way to work. Other people see the poster. Same professor told me this. His approach was, and this is like, you see this all the time, and I really like working this way now. Draw an envelope for your figure, like get an overall shape, and then draw the poster, the posterized shadow shapes, like the big shadow shapes. Draw those in. And I mean big. You're always going to make them too small because your eye sees more than the medium can create. That's in that Nathan Fox book. It's so good. Get that book on charcoal portrait drawing, no matter what your medium is. That book is gold. He talks about the fact that charcoal can only represent so many values, but our eyes see more. So we always try and make things more complicated than the medium will allow. So when you draw the poster, you're drawing the big shape of the shadow, like all that. And then you go in and refine that a bit more, refine it a bit more. But even I think they're beautiful when you've just got a big posterized shadow there. I think it's gorgeous because all of a sudden you've got a line, your your ground, which is your paper color, and then your shadow, and all of a sudden, boom. Like when that's done well, oh, I love it. So that might appeal to you. And the third way, and this is the second way that I started drawing after I was doing the drawing, sort of the Italian style. It's the French style, what I call the French style. It's French academic. That's where you draw a big envelope around the figure, like the big shape around the figure. Like you never start on like the eye and work your way out. Therein lies misery. Don't start on one thing and work your way out from it if you can avoid it. I mean, you can do it, but like it's better to get, like, no matter what, the big shapes first. So you draw a big shape around the figure, and then you start refining the envelope. So you start making smaller and smaller lines, finding the silhouette. If you look at drawings by Ingres or Degas or any of the French academic drawings, I love French academic drawing. If you get close to one and look at it, there are lots of little straight lines over and over. And as the artist was working on them, the bigger ones got obliterated. So you just see these little straight lines and then a beautiful curve describing the figure. So they basically work their way outside in. Italian, inside out. French, outside in. And then I would imagine that I have no basis in believing this, but I think that the Art Students League or the poster approach is kind of like American, like illustration, New York illustrators, 1940s, 50s. That's the impression I have because I associate it with that look. But like, you can break it down to those three types of things. So pick a way that appeals to your nature, and then draw that way. Because one of those is going to fit with you. Because I had an awful time before somebody said, draw through, draw the volume. And then I was like, okay, cool.
Yeah, you also just made a brilliant case for why it's so important to have a human transition with learning. I mean, tutorials and the democratization that we have of information today is fantastic. It's an amazing time to be an artist. But just, I mean, even literally right now, just getting to hear the breakdown of those three approaches, I'm taking mental notes. I'm going to go back and look at some things, and very, very invaluable.
Yeah,
Maddie, thank you so much for taking the time with us today. This has been wonderful, such a
thank
delight.
you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, we'll have to have you back to talk some more too.
I'd love
I'm with
to.
you. I could talk about this for the rest of the day, but we do need to
Yeah.
stick to time constraints. So
Yeah, well,
yeah,
thank you guys for the invitation. It's been a pleasure. And if anybody wants to reach out, I'm very accessible on the internet. Go to maddiemonster.com, friend me on Facebook. I hate Twitter. I'm never on Twitter, but I do have one. And my Instagram, I'm on a lot because it's all about images and art. And I really like Instagram. It's a very like positive place to be. But reach out, send me an email, say hi. Thank you for having me, and thanks for letting me ramble on for 2 hours. It was a pleasure.
oh, it was a delight. Thank you so much.
Cool.
So, everybody, thanks for tuning in. Our next stream coming up is going to be on Wednesday. That is the art jam that we do every Wednesday with our Chief Creative Officer, Josh Herman. And he has been working through some really cool character sculpts in ZBrush. So, if you're into doing that, you can hang with him for 3 hours and learn a little bit about what he's doing, but also just kind of have a partner in crime and keep you inspired, keep you going.
I know
If you
Josh. He's awesome.
Yeah, Josh is fantastic. And it's been wonderful being able to work with him at Gnomon. And if you want to be the first to know about the next content coming up, additional events and streams, guest artists, informational settings, all right here on these streaming platforms, follow Gnomon on social media. We're on Facebook as well as Instagram. We're constantly letting you know when things are happening as soon as we know. So hope to see you back here again really soon. Feel free to reach out as well if anything that you've heard might inspire you to educate yourself for some of Gnomon's offerings. I know that Madeleine is also teaching Gnomon classes, which right now are 100% online because of social distancing. So there's never been a better time to pick up an individual class. My name is Adam. I want to thank Miranda, who's been producing our event today. And have a great weekend, everybody. Stay safe and stay creative. And we'll see you back.